Welcome. Tonight, we'll take a quiet journey through the strange world of ancient professions. Not the exciting ones, like warriors or kings. No. We're going to meet the people who had important-sounding jobs. That turned out to be, well, not so important. In fact, many of these roles existed solely to maintain traditions, impress people who didn't know better, or just keep someone employed. Their titles sounded grand. Their daily tasks, less so. Before we begin, would love to know where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? You're home. Let's begin. We return once more to Egypt. Because if there was one place where job titles and reality rarely matched, it was the land of the pharaohs. Take, for instance, the royal toe wiper. Yes, it was a real job. In temples and royal courts, there was often a servant specifically designated to clean and wipe the feet and toes of their master. It sounds ridiculous. Because it was. But in a world where the cleanliness of the divine ruler mattered to cosmic balance, you couldn't just hand the pharaoh a towel. No, you needed a specialist. A trained wiper. Sometimes with a small cloth embroidered for the task. Imagine waking up every morning, putting on ceremonial garments, and preparing to crouch at someone's feet for 8 hours a day. And this was a respected position. Important. You weren't just wiping toes. You were maintaining the harmony of the kingdom. At least, that's what they told you. In ancient Sumer, writing was everything. The earliest form of script, cuneiform, was written using a reed stylus pressed into wet clay. And guess what? Those reeds had to be straight. Very straight. Enter, the reed straightener. It was their job to select, inspect, and prepare the reeds. They soaked them, smoothed them, dried them. Day in, day out. Reeds. Did it require skill? Technically. Did it sound noble? Only if you added official in front of it. But really, they were making pens. Not writing anything. Not reading anything. Just shaping sticks. Sometimes they worked beside scribes and watched them compose grand epics. The Epic of Gilgamesh? Probably written with a well-straightened reed. Which you sharpened. And didn't get credited for. In the long corridors of imperial China, appearance was everything. Robes had to be flawless. Hats had to sit just right. And facial hair, oh yes, had to be inspected. The imperial beard inspector wasn't a myth. He was a palace official. With one purpose. To make sure that court members' beards met imperial standards. Not too long. Not too short. Not patchy. No rebellious mustaches. They carried small combs. Measuring tools. Even scrolls with illustrations of approved beard styles. And if your beard wasn't up to code, you could be fined. Or worse, removed from court. Imagine waking up each day, walking past guards and generals, just to peer closely at a diplomat's chin. Maybe give it a little tug. Nod seriously. And then move to the next one. Not exactly thrilling. But it kept the empire in order. Apparently. The Greeks loved their olive oil. They used it for cooking, athletics, medicine, rituals, almost everything. So naturally, there had to be someone in charge of sniffing it. Meet the certified olive oil sniffer. His job? To determine whether the olive oil was of acceptable aroma. Each batch. Sniffed. Judged. Recorded. They would hover over amphory with a furrowed brow. Inhale deeply. Then say something like, slightly nutty. A hint of overripe figure. And that was it. That was the job. Not tasting. Not producing. Just smelling. Some were proud of their olfactory skill. Others went home wondering how their life had come to this. And yet, without them, someone might have cooked with subpar oil. A tragedy. Ah, Rome, where bureaucracy and spectacle collided. In the mighty Senate, decisions were made that shaped empires. But before those decisions, the chairs had to shine. Enter the Senate chair polisher. Yes, an actual position. Appointed, not elected. Every day, before sessions began, they would sweep through the curia with cloth in hand. Each senator's seat buffed to a gleaming finish. Why? Because senators complained. A sticky seat could ruin a toga. And a dusty bench could offend the gods. Or so they said. It wasn't glamorous. No marble statues were built for the polishers. No speeches recorded in their honor. But when the senators sat down and didn't wrinkle their robes, it was because someone spent an hour polishing pine wood. An unsung hero. With a rag. In ancient Mesopotamia, everything was made from mud. Homes. Temples. Walls. Even receipts were baked into clay. But before any of that was possible, someone had to count the bricks. The official mud brick counter had a tablet. And a stylus. And very little patience. He stood in the sun, watching as laborers stacked row after row of drying bricks. And he'd count them. One by one. Every day. All day. If someone dropped one, he noted it. If a brick cracked, he wrote it down. Not because it was interesting, but because someone had to make sure no one was stealing mud. Or making unauthorized bricks. There were quotas. Penalties. A whole mud-based economy. The brick counter wasn't a mason. Wasn't a builder. Just a quiet man with a stylus. And the knowledge that 482 bricks had been laid today. Not 483. He went home each night knowing his work mattered. In a very small, very dusty way. The pyramids are massive. Imposing. Timeless. And yet, the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with shadows. Particularly, how they fell on the royal tombs. That's why the pyramid shadow surveyor existed. He'd walk the perimeter of the pyramid. At sunrise. At noon. At sunset. And measure the angle and length of its shadow. With tools made from string, sticks, and very intense staring. If the shadow touched a forbidden zone, like a sacred well, or the garden of a priest, that was bad luck. He'd then file a report. Or deliver a verbal warning like, shadow slightly long today. Expect misfortune in 7 to 10 days. His job was part science. Part superstition. Part sunburn. He didn't design pyramids. Didn't enter them. Just stood outside, squinting at the ground. All in the name of good cosmic energy. He was probably very tan. And very tired. In ancient India, cows were sacred. They wandered freely through towns and markets. Respected. Untouched. But there was a problem. Traffic. So, the cities introduced a position. The sacred cow traffic officer. They wore simple robes. Carried a long stick. And had one goal. To gently guide cows away from narrow alleys and busy crossings. But they couldn't touch the cows. Or yell at them. Or scare them. They had to persuade them. With soft claps. Muttered prayers. And sometimes, music. If a cow decided to nap in front of the palace gates, the officer might sit nearby and play a flute until it moved. Hours later. They weren't enforcing laws. Just negotiating with sacred animals. Who didn't care. Sometimes the cows listened. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, the officer went home knowing he tried. Which, in that job, was a victory. In the courts of feudal Japan, silence was sacred. Especially in the presence of the shogun. Silence meant order. Discipline. Respect. But silence doesn't monitor itself. Enter the shogun's silence monitor. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried a fan. And an expression of constant disapproval. His task? To stand in the corner of ceremonial halls. Listen intently. And take note of any unnecessary sound. A cough. A whisper. A sandal scrape. Each one was tallied in his little scroll. Repeat offenders were politely escorted out. Or asked to reflect on their noisy spirit. He wasn't feared. But no one wanted to catch his eye. Especially not mid-sneeze. He trained his ears for years. Rumor had it, he could hear a teardrop hit the floor. True or not? People believed. And that was enough. So he stood. And listened. For a living. In medieval courts, royalty had many responsibilities. Wars. Feasts. Surviving bad medical advice. But there was one duty that could not be ignored. The daily royal nap. Of course, such a sacred event needed a professional. The royal nap coordinator. They didn't just fluff pillows. They orchestrated silence. Adjusted candlelight. Selected nap-friendly music, usually played on a single harp. They decided when the nap would begin. And when it would end. Even if the monarch was already asleep. They kept a strict nap journal. Recording insights like slept poorly, suspected draft, or slept well, dreamed of ducks. And if the monarch awoke cranky, the coordinator could be demoted to something awful, like royal laundry supervision. But if the monarch awoke refreshed, the coordinator was a hero. For 24 hours. A quiet profession. But one with high stakes. And a lot of lavender-scented towels. In the Aztec Empire, feathers weren't just decoration. They were sacred. Symbols of rank, divinity, and cosmic order. Which meant they had to be stored properly. Cleaned. Sorted. Arranged by color and bird type. That job belonged to the sacred feather organizer. It wasn't glamorous. Feathers shed. They tangled. And some were from birds that smelled strange. But someone had to count them. Inspect for flaws. And place them gently in temperature-stable rooms. Far from sunlight. And rodents. Each morning, they'd say a small prayer. Pick up a long comb. And begin their day. Plucking, sorting, filing. There were feathers from hummingbirds. Macaws. Even mythical birds no one was sure existed. And when a high priest asked for a headdress, the organizer would unroll a velvet cloth. And present 3 options. Ranked by plumage intensity. It was art. It was ritual. It was, oddly specific. In the scribal houses of Mesopotamia, clay tablets were everything. They recorded trade, laws, love poems, and taxes. Lots of taxes. But clay gets cold, and stiff, and cranky. So someone had to warm them. Before scribes could write. That someone was the official clay tablet warmer. Their tool? A heated sandpit. And a very specific wooden paddle. Each morning, they'd place the tablets near the embers. Rotate them slowly. Never too hot. Never too cool. Because if the clay cracked, the scribe blamed the warmer. So they waited. And watched. And occasionally, blew gently. Just to be safe. A job of timing. And very little glory. But without them, records would remain unwritten. History would be cold. And illegible. Cows were sacred. Symbols of wealth, fertility, and the divine. So when a royal cow looked at something strangely, someone had to interpret it. Enter the royal cow gaze interpreter. It wasn't astrology. It wasn't science. It was something, in between. They studied cow behavior for years. Pupil dilation. Tail swishes. The angle of a blink. If a cow stared too long at the western wall, it might mean a storm. Or a bad harvest. Or simply, indigestion. But the interpreter had to decide. And write a report. Cow stared at servant. Unclear if warning or affection. Cow avoided eye contact with priest. May indicate spiritual imbalance. The job required intuition. And a tolerance for mooing. Once, a cow sneezed during a temple ceremony. The interpreter fainted from the implication. He was fine. But the cow was revered for weeks. Russian winters were brutal. Even for royalty. And mittens were essential. But where to keep them? Who to trust with them? Who would carry the burden of warmth? That task fell to the Tsar's official mitten holder. They didn't knit. They didn't clean. They simply held 2 mittens. 1 job. Unblinking focus. They followed the Tsar everywhere. Ballrooms. Meetings. Sleigh rides. When the Tsar extended a hand, the mitten was ready. Like magic. Except colder. The mittens were embroidered with gold thread. And lined with fox fur. If a mitten fell, the holder apologized. Even if it was the wind's fault. And when not in use, they were stored in a special box. Wrapped in velvet. Guarded by a smaller mitten holder apprentice. A quiet existence. But oddly ceremonial. And never without purpose. Persian kings took their beards seriously. Long flowing. Scented. They were symbols of power, wisdom. And sometimes, the weather. Because when the wind blew, dust followed. And no one dared let dust settle on a king's beard. Enter, the royal beard dust monitor. They stood near the throne, carrying a feather fan and a silver mirror. Every few minutes, they'd inspect the beard. Not comb it. Not clean it. Just monitor. If particles appeared, they'd ring a small bell. Then a separate servant would brush it. But the monitor had to notice. Always watching. Always alert. One missed speck, and you might be demoted to sandal inspector. Which, in Persia, wasn't metaphorical. The Vatican received many letters. From kings, monks, bishops, and occasionally, people pretending to be all 3. Forgery was a problem. Ink could be copied. Seals replicated. But smell. That was harder. So, they hired the document sniffer. He didn't read Latin. He didn't write. But he could detect parchment origin, age, and authenticity. By scent. He sniffed scrolls in silence. Paused. And sometimes whispered. Florence. Or suspicious. His nose was insured. Twice. No one questioned his decisions. Even when he banned an entire shipment. For smelling too ambitious. Eventually, He retired. Claimed everything started smelling like onions. No one replaced him. Because no one else wanted the job. In Imperial Japan, the placement of flowers wasn't decoration. It was philosophy. Politics. Sometimes, prophecy. Especially chrysanthemums. Symbol of the emperor. So who decided where to place them? How many petals showed? How long they lasted? The arrangement regulator. They had a scroll of rules. 12 pages long. Written in delicate ink. With floral metaphors. Flowers must never face west. Unless it rained. Then slightly southwest. Colors had to reflect the season, the emperor's mood, and the quality of recent poetry. Once, a red bloom faced a diplomat. He took it as a threat. Talks collapsed. Trade paused. The regulator was scolded. Gently. With poetry. They wept. And replanted. Carthage was noisy. Markets. Ships. Goats. But in certain squares, silence was law. Forethinking. And dramatic pauses. To enforce it, they hired the public silence enforcer. No weapons. No armor. Just presence. And an intimidating finger gesture. When someone spoke, they approached slowly, locked eyes, and whispered, "Shoo," then walked away. Repeat offenders were offered earplugs. And a pamphlet titled, "Quiet is also a sound." Children feared them. Poets adored them. Singers avoided them entirely. During festivals, they were given vacation. But often returned early. Because the noise gave them headaches. Maya calendars were complex. Cycles within cycles. Each day with cosmic significance. But someone had to announce when a cycle ended and another began. That someone was the calendar reset announcer. Once every 52 years. They stood on a stone platform, wore ceremonial feathers, and said one word. Reset. Then walked away. That was it. But they trained for years. To pronounce it properly. To time it exactly. To resist sneezing mid-sentence. Villagers would gather. Wait in silence. And hear the word. Then nod. And return home. There were no parties. Just the satisfaction of cosmic punctuality. And so it went. Century after century. Empire after empire. Humans building complex systems. To make their lives harder, not easier. We wrapped the dead with spells. Bathed in oil while discussing taxes. Studied for 20 years to maybe get a job. And tried to avoid curses. By baking bread to regulation weight. Not exactly thrilling. But somehow, we kept going. There's nothing dramatic here. No epic conclusions. Just a quiet, slightly absurd journey. Through the overly complicated routines of people long gone. And now that you know just how tiring life used to be, you can rest. Sleep well.